Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the McLaughlin College. We have a lecture this afternoon from Zainub Verjee, and Zainub will be presenting on the Massey report at 70, Current Impasses and Prospects of Canadian Cultural Policy. But we'll begin with the York University Land Acknowledgement, which we do for all of our sessions at McLaughlin College. This meeting is virtual, and because of that, we are not actually gathered in the same space. York's land acknowledgement might not represent the territory that you are currently on, and it would ask, if that is the case, that you each take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory that you are on and its current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tookarondo has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. Zainub has been described as a trailblazer for her generation. And she's an accomplished artist whose works have been exhibited in Canada, the US, France, Mexico, India. And some of her artworks are in the permanent collection at the Vancouver Art Gallery. She is also an accomplished writer and critic. She's a cultural administrator and a public intellectual. She studied at Simon Fraser University and also at York University. And she has received many awards for her work, and most recently, she's the laureate of the 2020 Governor General's Visual and Media Arts for Outstanding Contribution. And she's currently the Executive Director of Galleries Ontario and Ontario Galleries. And she's one of the newest members of, newest fellows of McLaughlin College, and we're really thrilled that she's part of the fellowship here at McLaughlin. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Zainub.
Well, thank you. I will just share my screen and we can get begin. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Dr. James Simeon, for the invitation to speak and the kind words of introduction. And also thank you to everyone else for joining us this afternoon. I will begin with a land acknowledgement from where I am in Mississauga. I am located on the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant and is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. So my focus today is to lay out a perspective on the conundrum of cultural policy. And what I imply by this is the poverty of discourse on cultural policy and its relegation to the backwaters of public policy discourse. I've termed it the backwaters syndrome of cultural policy. Now, I will unravel a historic trajectory which illuminates such a status quo. And needless to say, of course, this is only one strand of an argument that I've picked up on, and this issue can be approached in many other ways. So let me set the stage for the talk today. The Massey report has been a significant part of my lived professional life. I've engaged with it in different fora and contexts, addressing multiple audiences. And today's presentation is not only a normative exercise, but includes my lived interactions, both with what the Massey represents, as well as my interventions in the domain of cultural policy, highlighting 3 points. The notion of a live document, 1. Second, agency and change. And third, the idea of the public good. Now, picking on the first point of this live document, the Massey report is very much alive and touches our lives and shapes our imagination without perhaps us consciously knowing it. Concomitant to this idea of a document is the second point of agency and change. The report defines both how agency is construed and activated, and change manifested. Agency and change have been the leitmotif of my work. And third, how the Massey report sets us on the path of the public good in its direct invocation of culture as a common good. And these are my framing thoughts on how I approach Massey report today. Now, with apologies to those already familiar with the background of the report, and for those who are not acquainted with it, let me offer a very quick overview of the Massey Commission. What I refer to as the Massey report was the report produced by the Commission, whose official name was the Royal Commission on National Development in the Arts, Letters and Sciences. It was established by order in council in April 1949 under the Liberal government of Louis. There were 5 commissioners: Vincent Massey, the chair and a former diplomat and Chancellor of the University of Toronto, Arthur Surveyor, Norman A.M. Mackenzie, and the Most Reverend Georges Henri, and the 4 men, 1 woman, Vancouver, Saskatoon, Toronto, Montreal, and Quebec City, 4 Anglophones and 1 Francophone. The mandate covered the entire field of letters, the arts and sciences within the jurisdiction of the federal state, which was extraordinary in scope. And I'll speak to the genius of this commission in its approach to the terms of order in council in a later slide. In 1951, the final report of the Royal Commission on National Development in the Arts, Letters and Sciences was released. Known as the Massey Report, it put forth a certain idea of nationhood and culture. In the 2 years between 1949 and 1951, the Commission hosted 114 public hearings in 16 cities in all 10 provinces. They received over 1,200 witnesses and 462 briefs. They commissioned studies on specific topics, established 4 advisory committees, met 224 times, and logged over 10,000 miles. When they finally reported in May 1951, the 517-page report contained 146 recommendations and was accompanied by 55 volumes of supporting documentation. The scope of the inquiry was unprecedented in Canada and has never been repeated. The Massey Report is a foundational document and remains so for the Canadian arts sector. 5 years after the release of the report saw the establishment of the Canada Council for the Arts, the creation of libraries and Archive Canada, and an expansion of the National Film Board. This document provided the armature of what would become a state-defined national culture in Canada and gave birth to a central and defining idea of Canadian content which is symbiotic with Canadian identity. Thus, not surprisingly, Massey Report becomes a subject and an object of scrutiny through my artistic lens, as seen in this image. In this image, you're seeing the details of my work at the 2020 Governor General's Visual and Media Arts Award Winners Exhibition, at the Art Gallery of Alberta. The book, that is the actual rare copy of the Massey report, is represented as a sculptural piece, an installation, as a ready-made to invoke Marcel Duchamp. Now, given such a broad and sweeping scope of this report, it invited critique intermittently over the decades. I've written and spoken on it extensively, terming it the Great Canadian Amnesia, suggesting that there has been a memory loss towards our approach to cultural policy. Premised on 19th century ideas of nation states' obligation towards civilization and less for culture, the Massey report becomes the political document that offers social control, protection, and patronage of arts towards its mandate of producing a national culture as part of its national building process. By the 1970s, the rumbling against the report had begun. Susan Crean termed it, quote, national identity as a cultural smokescreen, in her book, Who's Afraid of Canadian Culture, calling it the effort of an elite class of patrons to preserve its own cultural forms by transforming them into official culture. Maria Tippett, in her book, Making Culture, English Canadian Institutions and the Arts Before the Massey Commission, identified the ideological biases in how the elite kept the community artists, folk art, amateur artists, and artist activisms at bay. With this overview, let me now focus on the core issues that Massey at 70 invokes. One of the fundamental contestations that we need to address is the place of culture in the Canadian Constitution. The image that you see is of the Citizens Forum on Canada's Future. In Canada, the 19th Federation of Tomorrow Conference marked the beginning of the period of intense constitutional politics. In 1982, the federal parliament and 9 provincial legislatures agreed on the Constitution Act, which would bring the Constitution home from Britain to Canada on April 17, 1982. The only legislature that did not agree was Quebec. New negotiations led to the proposed Constitution Act of 1987, accepted by the 11 then ministers. This act dealt specifically with Quebec demands. Quebec had come aboard, but the new Constitution Act, known as the Meech Lake Accord, had to be ratified by the Parliament of Canada and all 10 provincial legislatures within 3 years. The deadline of June 23, 1990 passed without the necessary unanimous ratification, and the Meech Lake Accord died. Importantly, it should be noted here that the Indigenous people opposed the Meech Lake Accord. A critical factor was the failure of 4 First Ministers' conferences between 1983 and 1987 to resolve the issue of Native self-government. As Quebec felt betrayed by the failure of Meech Lake Accord, so did Indigenous people feel betrayed by the constitutional process. I just want to make a quick side note here that there was also this resurgence of red power marked from the Kenora occupation in 1974 to the Oka crisis in the 1990. And during the decade of the 80s, it produced an art history, which I spoke about at UCL in London, England, uncovering the ground, the other art histories of 1989, and the visibility of the Indigenous Renaissance. Now, given this level of distrust, the forum set out with a mandate to collect and focus citizens' ideas for their vision of the country and to improve the climate of dialogue by lowering the level of distrust. In accordance with the Order in Council dated November 1990, Chairman of the Forum, Keith Spicer, submitted the report of the Citizens Forum on Canada's Future. The purpose of the Citizens Forum on Canada's Future was to engage Canadians in a discussion about the political and social future of Canada. the Spicer Commission held town hall meetings across the country and solicited input from Canadians on the future of the country. In collaboration with the late Senator Laurien Lapierre, I was a moderator for Vancouver in BC to accomplish this task. In the wake of the failed Meech Lake Accord in 1990, Canada's political leaders got together for one more attempt at securing Quebec's support for the new constitution, which had been reformed 8 years earlier. The result in 1992 was the Charlottetown Accord, developed with input from these various groups, along with the federal and provincial governments. It proposed a plethora of changes to the Constitution, some of which were criticized for being ill-defined, contradictory, or a threat to individual rights and national unity. On September 24th, in 1991, the Government of Canada tabled in the federal parliament a set of proposals for the renewal of the Canadian Federation entitled Shaping Canada's Future Together. These proposals were referred to a special joint committee of the House of Commons and the Senate, which traveled across Canada seeking views on the proposals. The committee received 3,000 submissions and listened to testimonies from 700 individuals. On page 35 of this document, the government outlines its position with regard to culture. And on the screen, it's in the third and fourth column on the text, and I'll quote, "Our challenge, therefore, is to ensure, on the one hand, the maintenance of important Canada-wide institutions that help us to promote our identity. On the other hand, Canada's cultural policies and jurisdictions must offer the flexibility of ensuring that the roots of culture are enhanced and enriched, and there are no impediments to provincial governments playing the roles they deem appropriate in the culture." Further, and this is consequential, the Canada will therefore negotiate with the provinces, upon their request, agreements appropriate to the particular circumstance of each province to define clearly the role of each level of government. Where appropriate, such agreement would be constitutionalized. The two committees were identified and the arts sector was mobilized. One was the Special Joint Committee on a Renewed Canada, and then the Standing Committee on Communications and Culture. Before I go to discuss the place of culture in the Constitution, let me mention the stellar role that the Canadian Conference for the Arts played in these constitutional reforms deliberations. One of the oldest institutions, Canadian Conference of the Arts, was called the Canadian Arts Council. It had been formally constituted in 1945, 4 years before the Massey, as a multidisciplinary national arts advocacy body. When the Massey Commission was launched, the Canadian Arts Council took full advantage of the opportunity to put forward a strong vision for the future of the arts in Canada and recommended establishing a national arts body independent from government, strengthening Canada's arts training infrastructure, increasing the public's access to art, prioritizing cultural expression indigenous to Canada, and improving the economic circumstances of artists, and promoting a tri-level federal, provincial, municipal model of public support for culture. The Canadian Arts Council changed its name to the Canadian Conference for the Arts in 1958 to avoid confusion with the newly established Canada Council for the Arts in 1957. And under its new name, the Canadian Conference of the Arts continued to operate until 2012. The CCA produced a document of fundamental principles for a federal cultural policy and requested an endorsement of these principles by art organizations across the country to lobby the federal government. In this phase of constitutional reforms, the CCA demonstrated leadership in shepherding the arts and culture sector through the constitutional maze. And Keith Kelly, a friend of mine and with whom I had the honor of working closely with, published a paper, Why is Federal Responsibility for Culture an Issue? And here we see the very genesis of the impasse being foregrounded, the question of the place of culture in the Canadian Constitution. Now, I'm indebted to Patrick Monaghan, the former Osgoode Dean, York University Provost, and Ontario Deputy Attorney General, and now the Judge of Superior Court of Justice in Ontario, on his body of work on these contentious constitutional issues pertaining to culture. His writings and analysis of these issues, especially during the time of Charlottetown Accord referendum, were insightful and have influenced my understanding. I want to pick on the deliberations of the Standing Committee on Communication and Culture and point to two key observations. One, significantly, it noted that the Constitution is silent on the issue of jurisdiction over culture. However, it clarified that provinces generally were to retain control over provincial and local matters, which would invariably include culture. And two, it explored the idea of a cultural accord as a partnership between all levels of government, but did not offer any specifics, but general framework. However, the committee recommended that the cultural accord not be constitutionalized. And I'm trying to drive your attention to the fact that the committee says culture is not a category with any constitutional significance under the 1867 Constitutional Act. Either level of government is perfectly free to enact laws which might directly affect culture as long as there's an appropriate constitutional foundation for such laws in the Act. Well, one may ask, often defined in terms of collective ways of being, the term culture is indeterminate and all-encompassing, and that its inclusion would have rendered the entire division of powers almost incoherent. Now, as we know, these things are decided by the courts and not politicians. But we can't undermine highly intelligent and creative politicians, and here's a perfect example. The careful wording indicates that the federal policy would not pose threat to the provinces. Thus, the terms of order in council for the Massey Commission read, in the national interest to give encouragement to institutions which express national feeling, promote common understanding, and to add to the variety and richness of Canadian life, rural as well as urban. Massey's interpretation of the terms of the order in council, what we were required to deal with are only certain threads, and to ascertain its significance, it will be imperative to inquire into the vast fabric. This explains the vastness of the survey undertaken by the Commission, and more importantly, the Massey report defines a new role for government in relations to culture. It proposed that not only a concentrated national policy will help counter American hegemony on the one hand and develop an Indigenous cultural community on the other. And the report specifically identifies the role of arts as public pedagogy, the idea of pursuit of the common good, and the imperative of anti-materialistic premise to develop Canadian thought and the intellectual and cultural life. The post-war Western world saw the imperative of cultural policy to enable cultural development. Though this was a driver in Canada, the emphasis for cultural policy was geared towards the urgency to define Canadian identity and thus its place in the world. Massey Commission delivered on this notion of Canadian identity. And while this work on the Massey Commission is very present in the constitutional reform debates of the 90s, the Canadian government was cautious to assert itself on this policy file as questions about constitutional authority began to surface. But in all this fanfare of the Massey and the Canada Council for the Arts, I must point out that Alberta and Saskatchewan both had cultural funding agencies even before the Massey Commission was convened. Alberta's Cultural Development Branch was in 1946, the Saskatchewan Arts Board in 1948. And once the federal government took the lead, the provinces followed suit with legislation or orders in council authorizing provincial funding for the arts. And I think Quebec started in 1961 and the Ontario Arts Council in 63, followed by Manitoba, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, and then in British Columbia. In 1991, the discourse saw some provinces moving towards formal arts councils. And it is in this context I was invited to sit on the BC Arts Board by Minister Darlene Mitsari and to work with a wonderful cohort of experts towards the development of the legislation and Bill 12 Arts Council Act, which led to the foundation of the BC Arts Council. Now, as you can see in this diagram, the focus has shifted towards the province and the attempts to understand, can national cultural policy approaches be used for subnational comparisons? And here's the case of Ontario and Quebec. While I will not spend much time here, except to illustrate the new scholarly focus in this area. And here you see a new volume, Cultural Policy, Origins, Evolution, and Implementation in Canada's Provinces and Territories, recently published, that offers a comprehensive and comparative study and attempts to answer questions such as, how do Canadian provincial and territorial governments intervene in the cultural and artistic lives of their citizens? How have governments defined the scope, the concepts of culture and of cultural policy over time? Now, these questions are the same as we saw in the earlier discussions. And this volume is edited by Monica Gattinger and Diane Saint-Pierre et al. Just to note the authors. In a politically expedient measure, the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism in the 1960s offered the managerial template of multiculturalism to package difference as a recited truth in the context of sameness of the Massey report. And through the 80s to the early 2000s, the very locus of cultural policy has been a subject of intense debate as the central concerns of a cultural policy were co-opted by other disciplines such as culture studies and cultural anthropology in an evolving post-colonial discourse. However, the focus of that debate was pegged on meanings rather than management and governance of culture. However, today the central premise of a cultural policy is no longer the state patronage of art or value of art itself, but more focused on the citizen's right to culture. And this is different from the post-war impulse of democratizing culture, which took the form of audience development that both replicates and reproduces forces of the status quo. And the box office model is a further extension of this process of acquisition of cultural capital. Cultural citizenship actually was an American import. The origins parallels Canada's multiculturalism. And the American anthropologist Renato Rosaldo, working on the presence of Latinos in the United States, challenges the notion of the citizen mono-subject. The Massey report has passed the challenges of globalizations with the courtesy of a few corrections to the course. In an act of policy review, the 1982 Applebaum-Hebert report firmed up the nexus of national and neoliberal as the free trade offered a different logic to the process of establishing national culture. In the present pandemic, we witness the status quoist forces on one hand, and on the other, there are those who want to accelerate the entire neoliberalization of the sector, leaving no agency for artists and institutions, nor any possibility or advocacy on their behalf. From the post-war period to the 1970s, we see a clear indication of how the artists, through the process of institutionalization, were turned into professionals, and with the stated attempt to make them part of the middle class. The Massey Report of 1951 establishes the architecture of what Canadian culture should be and lays out the institutional process. Canada Council for the Arts, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the archives, the art galleries and museums, and many other things, and also the idea of Canadian content. 70s to 90s is the period of the onset and establishment of neoliberalism. In simple terms, the market becomes the champion through free trade, and culture becomes one of the commodities to be traded. Though I say this in one simple sentence, this process was not as simple and saw many upheavals. I was very much involved during these decades in many of those debates and contestations to protect, again, the interests and rights of artists. And the new ideas like managerialism and supply chain were introduced. And what we see is the direct pitching of the market and platform economy against the Massey Report. Now here we see a spectrum of views. The status of the artist is one of the most critical acts stemming from an international agreement of the United Nations in 1980. It's a 40-year-old issue and not fully dealt with. And as a result, what we see is that artists earn 43% less than general labor, and their atypical nature of work is not recognized. On the other hand, on the other side of this image, you see the pushback in content to address the challenges of the platform economy. The crises of cultural policy and institutions, if not of the Massey Report, then of its heirs and successors in cultural administration, is too important a story to be left to a future generation to tell. Today, as old narratives repeat, their biases both become more powerful and to those in power, more invisible. The Massey Report continues to have a bearing on the present state of crisis in the culture sector and its policy making. Systemic changes take time, and vision and a leadership with fortitude and selfless investment are needed. It is a good opportunity to address the ambivalence of culture in the Constitution Act of 1867 to help build a more robust cultural policy discourse. Now, in conclusion, I want to bring the conversation to art. It is at the center of cultural policy discourse, and these images are markers of this debate. Each of these three images illustrate the poverty of policy discourse pertaining to art, and what it demonstrates is the urgent need for public literacy. In the clamor, what gets lost is the fact that the arts are not just about an artist or a cultural institution or a work of art. They are a complex ecosystem, a web of processes, policies, institutions, and systems of knowledge. In the current crisis, it implies that in the domain of arts and culture, it is not the economics per se which is at stake, but rather the very political economy of the arts. The public policy context in which art and culture function is not a priority either for the politicians or even for the scores of artists and cultural workers who do not comprehend the politics of culture or the institutions that they engage with. This is complicated by the ambivalent nature of a cultural policy itself, let alone a more nuanced understanding of its differentiation from an arts policy. thus resulting in the poverty of public discourse. Yet every generation has their actors who end up fighting the cultural battles, often reinventing the wheel. For some, the exacerbation stems not only from the feeling of living in a loop reality, but through the fact that presents Canadian art as a fait accompli. Invariably, when one zooms out, the question gets posed in all seriousness. What is Canadian art? More precisely, what has become of art and culture in Canada in the past 7 odd decades in the post-war era? So I'm going to stop on that conclusion there, and just end with this this Lord Melbourne's dictum, I think, still stands the test of time. And thank you to everyone for listening. So I'll stop the share now.
Thank you very much, Zainub. I'd like to open the floor for any comments or questions from the audience. You have a number of ways of doing that. You can raise your hand under the participants section, or post your question in the chat, or alternatively, you could also raise your hand if I can see you in the gallery, from the gallery view. And as people are formulating their questions, perhaps, Zainub, I could ask you a question. You posed at the end, what is Canadian art? And I don't want to be flippant or, I guess, disrespectful in any way, but could you not argue that Canadian art is really what is displayed when Canadian artists are being featured, such as yourself, in the galleries across the province, across the country? So if one attends the various galleries, such as the Ontario Art Gallery or the Art Gallery of Alberta and so on, you are actually seeing Canadian art. And I'm not sure if anyone's cataloged this, but is that one way of viewing it?
Thank you for that question. It's such a great question. The reason that okay, so what is Canadian art is a very, I pose it in a rhetorical sense, but the Massey report actually puts into place, and as we see from some of the critiques that I mentioned earlier, a very Eurocentric position of what is the official culture and art of Canada. And anything that falls out of that then is regarded often as ethnic or community or folk or something else. And so the Massey itself, it becomes very problematic from one aspect, in that it is actually talking about the art of 2 founding nations, and the institutions that are formed embed that very deeply. So if you're not part of that institutional set, if you haven't grown up in it, if you are not part of that, then you're not part of that official Canadian culture. It's very difficult to get funding to make the work, and it's also very difficult to get exhibited. And so, you know, Canadian art cannot just be relegated to those confines. And I think that's the contestation, and it still continues.
Thank you. I see a question from Philip McEwen. Philip, do you want to ask your question?
Well, thank you very much, Zainub, for that presentation. My question has to do with the concept of Canadian culture. And the Massey report has now, what are some of the main, perhaps the salient changes that you've seen in the concept of Canadian culture over the 70-year history of the Massey report? Big question, but perhaps you could identify one or two salient features that are outstanding in the concept of Canadian culture. That's my question.
Great. Can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear you now.
Hello? Yeah, okay, sorry, thanks. Yeah. I think that what we need to do, I mean, okay, 70 years of the Massey, and I think we could say there's been lots of changes, but I think what we need to do is excavate the Massey report out of its orthodoxies to make it a more energetic and relevant and present to a new generation. Now, if we look at Canadian culture and how it's evolved over the 70 years that of the founding of the Massey, I think its salient features still remain, you know, the common good, the idea of the common good, the public good. I think the focus on the artist is really important, and the need for institutional support. And I think what we're looking at is how have we understood that common good? What is the public good? What is the public literacy of that? And where is the status of the artist? And then how have institutions responded or not in over the 70 years? And so I think it's been a push and pull. I think things have been in flux, and we are in constant. We're constantly being juxtaposed against, you know, right now what we're calling the platform economy, with more and more being taken away. And so Massey, on the one hand, which was formed with the idea of, you know, Canadian content, and on the other hand, we've got like Netflix and Facebook and Google News issues coming up. And so I think, you know, in 2017, with great fanfare, right, Creative Canada was branded as an overhaul of national cultural policies for the digital age, but it flopped. And I think in a podcast on, you know, on the death of an artist and the platform economy, that platform economy with which we're confronted is about big data. It's not about art or artists. And I think, as one commentator has observed, that Creative Canada won't protect the distinctiveness of Canadian art, but will shackle it to the homogenizing logic of corporate analytics. And the result will be a more calculated, data-driven, you know, snackable Canadian culture, one chasing web hits abroad in order to justify its funding at home, for example. So I think that we will always have these contestations, and we see now exactly where we are with these big giants.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
I did speak with William Derowitz on a podcast. He wrote a book called The Death of the Artist, in which I unpack some of these issues about Canadian culture. And if I can find the link, I'll try and pop it into the chat so that people can have it.
Thank you, Zainub. We've got a number of questions that have come into the chat. I'm going to start with City Chen. City, would you like to ask your question? Well, perhaps
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you, Zainub. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I always appreciate that. And I want to echo to what you said that every generation will invent new ways to address the challenges in the sector. And my question is that what do you see as the current challenge or the status quo that need to be shaken in our art sector, especially from the perspective of the Massey report?
I'm just, sorry, just reading your chat, actually. I'm just reading your question on the chat, Siddhi. Just want to echo what you said. Yeah, that's a good question. So while we see the strength of the Massey and its immense work that it done and the brilliance of the report, I think that that these questions of what becomes official culture, or what is, as to James' question of what is seen in galleries, isn't that Canadian art? I think we also have to look at its orthodoxies and see what does it mean. I mean, that was written in 1957, and so what is today's, most importantly, how can that be revised to be meaningful for today's era and the future? And I think that is the work that has not been done. It has been updated here and there, like I mentioned, the Applebaum report, but I think we have to decide what needs to be shaken, what, collectively, what needs to be shaken to update the Massey, but also to make it relevant for a larger Canada.
Thank you very much. I have a follow question, but I'll let other question roll first. I will type in the chat and then we can get to it if we have more time.
We have a question from Elizabeth Chitty. Elizabeth, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, so Zainub, I've asked you to speak to the notion of public good, which I know has already been referenced, and there's a question that follows mine, but specifically in the context of the contemporary rise of the alt-right, which in a way is just a new, perhaps more extreme twist on what the Massey Commission was responding to in the first place, in terms of popular culture of the mostly coming from the US. So I'm asking you to talk about what the notion of public good means within the context of like art not having value. You've referenced, and it was referenced 70 years ago, that the kind of poverty that artists live in, and that speaks to the social context in which art simply is not commercial. I hope those 2 points don't seem disparate. To me, they seem an expression of pretty much the same thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, I think that over the years we've seen different people that have really tried to address some of these issues. I invoke Bernard Ostry, who wrote Cultural Connections, and in which some of these things come out. But the Massey also talks about education as a public good, but we see the state of education under neoliberalization and what's happened with it. You're right, and this is why we want to have these conversations like the one we're having today, because the issues at hand are large, and we really need to sort of come back, I think, to some common understanding about, what is the public good? Why should we be worrying about it? I know that the Applebaum report focused in on economics. But currently, right, we are being very focused in on social impact, and you literally cannot get funding if it doesn't have social impact. And I think basic income, is a modality to pursue that public good. And hence the work that, I've been doing on that area, because that's literally about the poverty of artists, the fact that their status, that they earn 43% less than general labor. And so, I think that for me, it's about really bringing back these things through those different kinds of modalities, right? Such as basic income.
Thank you. We have a question from Margaret Trumka. Margaret, would you like to pose your question?
Sorry, hi. I'm navigating my iPhone to see what I wrote. Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I may have missed what you were saying, so I apologize for that in advance, but Zainub, it's such a basic and lovely reminder about arts and the ecosystem we're in with artists and institutions and so on. And you touched on our need to enhance visual literacy. And then your conversation navigated to supporting artists, and I would say even ourselves as institutions, in navigating, I think you mentioned political systems. And I may have that wrong, but in that context, have you seen recently successful efforts where this is being undertaken?
I just want to make sure I understood your question correctly. So I spoke about the fact that we need to build public literacy and
right.
Sorry, could you?
Yeah, so I guess I was really, I work at an arts institution, so of course I'm always probing this, but how would you have you seen sort of successful examples where institutions are supporting artists in sort of developing this public literacy that you speak of? And then parallel to that, I think you had mentioned something about needing to provide support or something to artists in navigating these political systems that may be less familiar to them. And maybe I got that wrong on what you were speaking about, but I'd be curious for you to elaborate on that.
Yeah, Margaret, thank you. I don't think it's necessarily the role of the institution to create that public literacy. I think public, it has to occur, and there's many interventions, but public policy discourse is one area, understanding of the Constitution and why this conundrum exists of not having culture embedded in it is the other. And artist public pedagogy is really key in this, and so I think that when you say, are there any institutions that I know that have done this well or are doing it? I think you need to, I'm not sure if you know the work of Timothy Porteous, excuse me. He was in Ontario and also the director at the Canada Council, who really talks about the sort of issue of arm's length and building, the understanding, in the for the public to have literacy about the arts. And those three works that I show actually really shows that lack of public literacy, and each one, right, from the Voice of Fire to the Invisible Colors poster to the work of Kent Monkman, really speak to the issues at hand. But look at the current government currently, and bypassing the Ontario Arts Council in making decisions of which organizations, I'm talking about the Ontario context, of who will get funding and who will not, and kind of completely putting arm's length, chopping it off, as it were, right? And so I think that if it's not embedded in the psyche, right, through the Constitution, we have a lot of work to do in terms of building that public literacy. And we need more discourse and more pedagogy.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Perhaps we can come back to City for his follow-up question.
Thank you very much. And the public question and what Margaret was asking was a little bit what I wanted to follow up. So after the Massey Commission and the Arts Council Act, and so now we have more like a systematic a system that's inside this government structure that's operating in the art following the Massey Commission, while artists also in comparison to when the commission was written, that the artist movement has the artist run center movement or other artist rights movement has definitely been more predominant than before. So my question is, so while the institutions and structure like the government is trying to use the Massey Commission to contain the status quo, while artists are trying to use it to fight for their own right. So how do you see this conflict while both sides of the party are using the same source to get more of their own benefit? So specific, my question comes from like that now arts are ever interdisciplinary, while the funding structures are really restricted on what art could look like or who could be defined as an artist. So that's where I see this very systematic conflicts and tension, where one side is using the idea drawn from the Massey Commission to defend their own right, while the other side is using the result of the Massey Commission to maintain the status quo. So I'm wondering, so how you can see this conflict and tension could be resolved, and how we can proceed from when this tension is in place.
Yeah, thank you. I think what I understood was, I think that the paradox you point to is about the place of culture in the Constitution, and that needs to be addressed, is what I'm hearing. I mean, I think the specificities of what you're describing have to do with this sort of conundrum of culture and Constitution. Is what I understood from what the paradox anyway that you're pointing out. I'm not sure if I've addressed your question, but I think you were trying to sort of lay out, you know, from the Massey to now the Artist Run Center to other kinds of movements. Is that right?
Yes, in a way. I want to ask, like, is that in the grassroots level, where artists are getting more rights and they has more movements that focus on the artists themselves and the culture, the community that built around that, while in the structural side, in a government policy level and the arts council, the provincial arts council structure that also they are the outcome and result of the Massey Commission, but they are there to hold the status quo of what's being achieved and in the structure, while they are such swift change at the grassroots level. And considering both of them are the result of the Massey Commission, how can we resolve this paradox and the conflict and tension in the case? Does that make sense?
I think I did, and I guess you know, the thing is that I think that that even as an artist, even if you're not involved with policy, it doesn't mean that you're not bound by whatever you know, act or policy measures are in place, and that they are going to definitely have an impact, or are, you know, you're going to find yourself within an ecosystem that is going to very much be bound by whatever the policy diktat is of the country or the province, or even at your local level, and you're embedded in it, whether or not you are operating of the knowledge about it, but you are still, you know, going to be enveloped by it and are going to function within it, is how I understand that. I'm still not sure I've fully understood your question, but I apologize if I'm not able to fully understand. But I think no one is exempt, right, from the structures that we're embedded in.
I think it actually answered the question. It at least give a really nice direction on where this talk could continue. And thank you very much for your time and your knowledge. Thank you.
Zainub, I wonder if I could perhaps ask the last question, because I know we're over time and hopefully people can indulge us with this. One of the things I miss, because the university is locked down and I'm at the main campus at York University, is that I think York is reflective of this with other institutions, how universities are in fact promoting art as a public good, because we have a number of art galleries on our campus, as you probably know, and we have art sculptures on display on our campus. So you can also think about the architecture as well. And then of course, people can study art there. We have the School of Arts, Media, Performance and Design. And so I miss that aesthetic in terms of my workplace. But I'm wondering if these are sites in terms of the promotion of Canadian art as well. Not only the production, but also the aesthetic and the appreciation that goes along with that. So if you've got any comments on that.
Absolutely, you're right, and the university has a very vibrant art gallery, in fact, and you know, the departments there for both film, video, and the visual arts, and of course, as you mentioned, the architecture itself is of interest, plus the work in the public spaces. But the point is who's deciding who gets to show them? Who gets to decide what will be shown there, and what you know, what the programming will look like, what the public engagement will look like, and how much of that public engagement is measured by the needs of the university, and also by what the government, you know, funding dictates that it should be showing. And I guess that's the political part, right? It's the politics of all of these things. And you know, I mean, I think just the whole thing with the Massey, and because of its Eurocentric, you know, positioning, and as really, you know, Anglo and Francophone positioning, of which Indigenous is not part of it, and also to make it separate and different from the American hegemony. But you know, as I said in that multiculturalism and managerial multiculturalism piece of like having, you know, let's celebrate difference in the context of the sameness of the Massey, it's complex, but it's political. And I think that, and although a university gallery, I think, does have more opportunity to create the spaces for the discourse, you know, and hopefully create the questioning and ask those questions, because a municipal gallery definitely will not have that same agency, let's say, for that questioning, or nor will an independent not-for-profit or a regional gallery have the same impetus, as it were.
So thank you very much for your presentation, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue. I invite you back in the future for further presentations now that you were a fellow of our college. And I'd like to thank everyone else for joining us here today. Thank you very much for your attendance. I'd like to invite you all back to future events at McLaughlin College. And although this is I think the last event that we have on our schedule, because the exam period starts actually tomorrow, I think our next event is going to be for the fellows at the college, but please visit our website. We have all upcoming events and activities at the college on our website, so you can find us there, and we look forward to seeing you at future events and activities at the college. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.